Hey y'all, this is David, the Georgia photographer. What I want to talk about today is exposure compensation. Exposure compensation is a function built into virtually every DSLR that's been built. Even the cheap bottom of the basement ones have a way of adjusting exposure compensation. Exposure compensation is basically telling the camera whatever value it reads that's going to be the exposure that it determines through the metering system in the camera. You're telling it, you're adjusting it by, well, these are typically in 1/3 stop adjustments, either brighter or darker than whatever the camera thinks it should be. Most of them have something like spot metering, where just one spot in the frame is what it's going to determine how bright or how dark the exposure needs to be. It'll have typically center weighted, where it'll put like 70% of the calculation on the center portion of the frame and 30% on the perimeter, usually, something like that. Then the third one is what Nikon calls matrix metering, and that one is where it meters the whole frame and tries to basically get it to 17 or 15% neutral gray. Problem is, it doesn't know what you want to take a picture of. So you have to be able to control that to some degree. Without exposure compensation, you really don't have a way of doing it short of going into pure manual mode. If you go into manual mode, the exposure compensation won't do anything because you already have taken absolute control of the frame. You're telling it how much ISO to use, ISO, depending on where you're standing.
And maybe to make matters worse, a lot of us have been mispronouncing it, saying ISO as if it were an acronym, and this is...
And how fast the shutter's gonna fire and how big the aperture's gonna be. It's just going to capture the data that you're telling it it's going to capture. So manual mode's out of the picture for this. You get to use exposure compensation in program mode, shutter priority, and aperture priority, and that's it. Okay. So what happens is you put it in aperture priority. That gives you control of the aperture, and the camera does the rest of the thinking for you. It's still going to try to come up with that good balanced exposure. Here's the catch: it's still going to try to do it based off the metering mode you're picking. Now, that being known, what you can do is you can come in here and on the XT3 here, I can go as much as 5 stops above or below the value it chose. There's a caveat to running exposure compensation. When you get done, always put it back to 0. You don't know how many times I have got done shooting with my camera, get it out the next day to do something, forget that I've got a half or 2/3 of a stop of exposure compensation dialed in, and all of my shots are overexposed, and I can't figure out for the life of me why, because I left that stupid dial set when I got done. If you can learn to do it early on, life will be so much easier. I'm just telling you, when you get done taking your shot where you're using it, go ahead and set it back to 0. Like right now, I just now put it back on 0 on this camera. Some cameras don't have a dedicated dial like the XT3. They might have a button you press, like my D810 and that D200 have a button on them that looks like a little plus and minus button. You hold it down and the back thumb wheel will dial it in, and it shows up on the little digital readout. You can actually see it's got a little bar runs back and forth, and even on the display on this it shows you. So you can see when you're looking through the viewfinder, if you have the information display up, it'll actually show you the exposure comp. It's got a little finger that runs up and down beside it so you can see what's dialed in and what isn't. But that's my tip for the day. Learn to use exposure compensation. Play with it. You can't hurt the camera playing with it. Get out, shoot some frames, turn it up, see what happens when you overexpose. Turn it down, see what happens when you underexpose. You want a real dark and moody print? Take a stop a light out with exposure compensation. Turn it down to -1. Everything's gonna be darker. And with that, I appreciate you guys watching. And this is David, the Georgia photographer, and we'll see y'all later. Bye-bye.